Aloha! This Traditions of the Pacific lecture is titled A Society That's Self-Destructed, Recent Archaeological Research on Rapa Nui, presented by Dr. Mara Mulrooney. This was recorded on Thursday, August 29th, 2013.
So tonight what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is a collaborative research project that's been going on for a number of years. And we're going to travel to the easternmost apex of the Polynesian Triangle, Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. Rapa Nui, of course, is very famous for its megalithic stone statues, of which there are about 1,000. They're called moai. But lately, Rapa Nui's taken center stage for a very different reason. If people have read anything about Rapa Nui, oftentimes it has to do with the word collapse. Now, Jared Diamond, of course, wrote the most popular account of Rapa Nui's supposed collapse, but that book is just one of many archaeological syntheses, popular accounts, and even Hollywood productions. I don't know if any of you have seen Rapa Nui the movie. Wonderful scenery, storyline. I won't comment on that tonight. So if we look at the popular story of Rapa Nui then and look at a quote from Jared Diamond, he describes Rapa Nui as the clearest example of a society that destroyed itself by overexploiting its own resources. Now this collapse scenario is known as Overshoot and Collapse. Essentially, as the story goes, the Rapa Nui people committed environmental suicide, or what Terry Hunt calls ecocide, according to this popular narrative. Now, what does this mean? Of course, this means that we have an instance of resource degradation, especially measured through deforestation on the island, and overpopulation that led to an ecological catastrophe and a resulting demographic or population loss and societal collapse. And that's what's shown in this graph here. Basically, you have declining resources mixed with a growing population, and it leads to catastrophe according to this popular narrative. So what archaeologists have noticed in recent years is that this story doesn't necessarily stack up. And as I began doing the background research for my PhD, I noticed that a lot of people who had come before me had noticed significant gaps in the evidence for this monumental collapse that supposedly happened on Rapa Nui. So we have a series of authors listed here. This, of course, is not a comprehensive list, but at the bottom there you'll see my name as one of these folks, and that's only recently after quite a few years of research on the island. So if we think about this research and contextualize it within that background, the overall research program, or my research, is part of a larger overall program that's directed by Professor Thane Ladefoged of the University of Auckland, Dr. Chris Stevenson, who's at the Virginia Commonwealth University, and also involves our colleague Sonia Hawa, who's a Rapa Nui archaeologist, Oliver Chadwick, who's a geologist at UCSB, and Peter Vitusek, who's a soil scientist at Stanford. And so the objective overall is to collect various lines of archaeological data that empirically assess aspects of the collapse scenario for Rapa Nui. So while previous authors noted that there were gaps in the empirical evidence, we're really the first team who's gone to the island to really figure out whether there is or is not empirical evidence for this collapse. Now, in terms of specific research objectives, what we're doing is analyzing the spatial and temporal evidence for or against that collapse narrative during late prehistory or just before European contact, which initially occurred in 1722. To do that, we're looking predominantly at settlement and land use on multiple scales, both at an island-wide scale and at a series of micro-regional scales on the island, one of which was the focus of my doctoral dissertation research, and that's indicated there in the red square, the Hangaho'onu project area. Now, before I get into our research and share some of our results with you, I'd like to outline a little bit of background and outline some of those gaps that we've encountered in the literature and in this very popular story of collapse on the island. So what you see here is a table or a graphic of cultural chronologies that have been presented for the island. And beginning in 1961 with the work of Tor Heyerdahl and his team, who were the first to go to the island and carry out systematic archaeological research in 1955 to 1956, what they did was to use very early radiocarbon dates from sites that they excavated around the island to propose that Rapa Nui society could be divided, or culture history could be divided into three basic phases or periods, which they called, of course, early, middle, and late. And so in the early period, we have colonization, settlement, and adaptation to the local environment, followed by a middle period with expansion, development, and chiefdom integration, followed by the late period, which of course is post-collapse, and they date the collapse at AD 1680, based on a single radiocarbon date mixed together with or supported by genealogical estimations. Now, this period, according to these and other scholars, was a period of warfare, fragmentation, widespread famine, cannibalism, and general unrest, and then was followed by post-contact decline. And what you'll see if you look at the breakdown of these cultural chronologies is that, with the exception of Hunt and Lippo at the bottom here, all of these scholars have proposed that that collapse occurred before European contact at 1722. So what we have is an instance where we have a chronology that was established early on that other scholars then collected evidence and sort of placed right into that pre-existing chronology. So if we focus in then on the late period and we look at this orthodox culture historical model that's really based on three types of evidence, if we go through each of those lines of evidence, we can actually find a few holes. So the orthodox culture historical model is based on archaeological evidence, paleoecological evidence, and also ethnohistorical evidence. So what I'd like to do tonight for you all is to sort of go through each of these lines of evidence and actually empirically assess that evidence for collapse. So if we look at the archaeological evidence to begin with, and we can begin with Kirch's 2000 6 lines of evidence, or the 6 lines of evidence for collapse that Kirch presented in his 2000 synthesis. And we can identify the destruction of elite dwellings, or hare paenga, which is pictured there on the top. We have these beautifully dressed curbstones with a nice big front patio or pavement of large water-worn boulders, or poro. Habitation in refuge caves, one of which is pictured there. These are caves that are fortified at the entrance. And so they're seen as destructive, or a note, or a, what do I want to say? They're seen as a feature of post-collapse, right? People are warring, so they're going to be living in these refuge caves, or these anakionga. He also cites the manufacture of obsidian spear points, known as mata'a, or what's been interpreted as obsidian spear points, cannibalism, changes in burial practices, and an ideological shift from Ahu to Orongo. Now, to those lines of evidence, Stevenson in the past added additional lines of evidence of the abandonment, complete abandonment of upland agricultural field systems, and a major settlement shift that involved the, quote, desanctification of coastal areas and the reuse of ahu. So here we have an example of an ahu. This is a sketch field map of an ahu in my project area. And what we can see is 2 toppled statues lying face down, probable burial chambers underneath them, and then we have the addition of gardening enclosures, which of course is not a very sacred activity. To be gardening adjacent to your sacred site indicates that perhaps that site is not so sacred anymore because you're carrying out everyday activities there. Now, he also notes a decreased population as an additional line of evidence. So if we look at that first line of evidence in Kirch's synthesis, and that is the destruction of elite dwellings and the habitation in refuge caves, we can see a couple problems with that story. Now, the first is that we have very limited dates from these refuge caves, and so in terms of the dates, 2 have been dated The dates are all over the place, and so it's kind of difficult to say when when those were actually occupied. So very limited dates there. And another issue is that throughout the Rapa Nui cultural sequence, we see a lot of recycling going on. And you can see that very clearly in these photos that I've included. Here we have Ahu Now on Akina. You can see the head of a moai that is incorporated into the seawall at that Ahu. You can look at Ahu Tepeu, that's on the west coast of the island, and you can see that they have those nicely cut Hare Paenga stones or curb stones incorporated into the seawall, again, of that Ahu. So the reuse of those stones not only in Anakionga or refuge caves, but also in sacred Ahu complexes. Now here is one of my favorite examples. We have an entire statue that's incorporated into the seawall of a northwest coast Ahu. So as you can see, recycling was the norm, and in terms of the recycling of material and destruction of certain features, it appears based on this that it was going on throughout the Rapa Nui cultural sequence. Now if we turn to the artifacts and the notion of widespread warfare taking place on Rapa Nui, these are a few examples of those obsidian mata'a, which have traditionally been interpreted as weapons. However, more recent evidence from archaeologists working with these types of artifacts has shown that instead of residues of blood collagen, for example, they actually have residues of plant remains, especially economical plants like taro and kumara, or sweet potato. And in addition to those residue analyses of Church and Ellis and their colleagues, other archaeologists have also done use-wear analysis, and they've pointed to a probable primary function as agricultural implements and as wood carving implements. So in terms of seeing those as weapons, perhaps they were reused later on as weapons. We do have a couple of examples where there is pretty good evidence that they were used as weapons at some point, but in terms of their primary functions, the evidence does suggest that they were agricultural or carving implements. Cannibalism. Cannibalism on the island is really inferred from the presence of human bones in middens and charred human remains. However, this is unsurprising because in the pre-European contact period, cremation was preferred by the Rapa Nui, and so to have burnt human remains is not really surprising when you're cremating your dead. Now, in terms of fishhook manufacture, sometimes human femurs were used to fashion fishhooks as they were elsewhere in the Pacific, and the osteological evidence as well has a few gaps. Owsley and his colleagues back in 1994 looked at a sample of 462 individuals who were in the museum on Rapa Nui. Now, these individuals were collected from various locations on the island, from the surface and also from burial caves in some instances, and they were loosely dated to the late pre-contact or proto-historic period. So those are totally loosely dated. It's sort of conjecture. And what Owsley found is that less than 2% of fatalities were directly attributable to violence. Now, of course, when you're only dealing with skeletal material, you might not get the complete picture, but still fairly strong evidence that pictures like this from Easter Island Underworld, that many of you may have seen from National Geographic in 2009, where you have the Rapa Nui running through the quarry with mata'a chasing each other and looking a little bit like that. Yeah, maybe not so well supported after all. Now, in terms of burial practices, just as the case was with the potential shift to living in Anakionga, it's very difficult to date burial practices. And so the popular story suggests that there was a shift from cremation behind platform Ahu to extended burials in a whole new range of features, including semi-pyramidal Ahu and Ahu Poi Poi, like the one pictured here, Avanga and caves. But again, it's very difficult to date that burial event. Usually burials are dated using associated materials but those materials may have been older construction materials, for example. So very difficult to date those. Now, in terms of the proposed ideological shift, the collapse narrative suggests that there was a shift from community-based platform ahu and the worship of community-based statues, especially, or moai, to the Birdman cult, which was centered at the ceremonial village of Orongo up on the cliffs overlooking these three small motu. And so in the historic period, there was an annual competition where competitors from each territory on the island would compete in this annual competition, and the winner's high chief would become high chief or ariki mau of the island for the next year. Now, when this tradition started is anyone's guess. In terms of the oral traditions that go along with it, it was stopped in the 1860s by missionaries, and a lot of the knowledge was lost thereafter. So in terms of counting back and recounting the winners of this competition, certainly does not go back all the way into the pre-contact period. So it is possible that the Birdman cult developed after European contact. It's also possible that these two systems aren't so separate after all. And so if you look at a statue like Ho'ahakananaia, who is over in the British Museum now, Ho'ahakananaia was taken from inside one of the ceremonial houses at Orongo in 1868. And what you can see very nicely is a lot of the symbolism that's associated with the Birdman cult that is on Ho'ahakanaia's back, that's carved into his back. And so you can see all of these symbols that symbolize fertility, right? They don't symbolize military or warriors or some of the things that people have attributed that competition to. Now, in terms of those lines of evidence that Chris Stevenson added previously, in terms of a major settlement shift, that major settlement shift is based on very limited evidence as well. And so Stevenson and others, including Vargas, have proposed that inland agricultural field systems were completely abandoned. And if you look at this model, this is a model that was presented by Dr. Stevenson and Sonia Hawa in their 2008 book. And so if you look at this model, what you can see is that 5-phase chronology that's based somewhat closely, right, on Thor Heyerdahl and Ferdinand's chronology from back in the day. And so what you can see is initially we have colonization, people arrive, they start to build sacred sites on the coast, they start to inhabit the coastal plain, and then we have temporary dwellings up in the upland as people are practicing slash and burn agriculture and getting their agricultural economy going. Same story in phase 2 until about 1425. We have further development in all regions, an elite village, which indicates the hierarchy is developing, or the chiefdom is developing. And then up in the uplands, we have some secondary ahu structures and rectangular houses, which are interpreted as elites or chiefs' houses up there. So they're managing agricultural production up there, which continues into phase 3 until the supposed collapse. And what they propose is that there's complete abandonment of those interior or upland regions. As the society collapses, the worship of moai stops, for example, and the hierarchical system is replaced by a very competitive one. And so what we have in terms of the settlement pattern, according to these researchers, is a contraction back to the coast and that desanctification of the coastal area. You have those elite villages being taken over by commoners, essentially, right? And anarchy ensuing on the island. So I'll return to this, but I wanted to outline that cultural chronology in space and time for you. Okay, if we move on to the paleoecological evidence then, most of the paleoecological evidence is based on the work of John Flenley and his colleagues, and what they've done is taken pollen cores from the 3 crater lakes on the island, and they've developed a general temporal sequence. And what we have in general is deforestation, where we have a lot of trees indicated in the lower levels of the pollen cores, and through time those are replaced by ferns and herbs mostly. So good evidence for deforestation in terms of what the island looks like today. That's a shot of the project area where I've been working. And as you can see, not a tree to be seen in that particular area of the island. Whereas in the past, we do have good evidence that the island did support a very large palm forest. And so what Flenley and his colleagues have proposed is that what we're looking at here is a process of deforestation leading to widespread erosion. Now, Meath and Bork have picked up on that story, and looking at landforms on the island, they saw deforestation as a trigger for what they refer to as widespread erosion. However, their research is focused right here on the Poike Peninsula, which is the oldest part of the island, and you can see based on their book cover, it looks really, really bad, really eroded, large amount of sheet erosion. But if you look at the rest of the island in this aerial photo, what you can see, or in this satellite photo, what you can see is that you don't have that widespread erosion on the rest of the island. Now, Lou Weiji's land evaluation study, which formed the basis of her dissertation, really noted the marginal nature of Rapa Nui soils overall, and what she proposed is that erosion probably actually predated human arrival. So in terms of deforestation leading to widespread erosion and a loss in production in terms of the terrestrial resources, there are a few holes in that line of evidence as well. Now, if we move on to the historical accounts and look at early European accounts, as with elsewhere in the Pacific, people usually stopped only for a couple days, and that was certainly the case on Rapa Nui. There were some not so pleasant encounters, but what these accounts really do allow us to get is, although it's going to be biased, obviously, they do give us a snapshot into that visit. And so when Jacob Roggeveen and his crew arrived on Easter Sunday in 1722, they noted that the people were, quote, tall, muscular, and well-proportioned. They said that they had no weapons and relied on their gods, which stand erected. They also talked about people bowing down in front of the ahu, in front of the statues in some sort of ritual. And they noted that women, quote, sat before us and disrobed, laughed, and were very friendly. So we can only imagine the kinds of interactions that may have taken place then. Now, when Cook arrived in 1774, it was a very different story. Let me go back to Roggeveen. Roggeveen and his crew also noted that they had a lot of agricultural foodstuffs that they traded with the men on board the ship. Now, when Cook arrived, the story was very different. In 1774, Cook noted that agricultural plantations had been destroyed or abandoned, that some of the statues had been toppled, and he also noted that the islanders in general were, quote, small and miserable. So based on those very limited accounts, it seems to me that perhaps there was a significant change that took place within that 50-year period following European contact, which is not very surprising because, as we know from elsewhere in the Pacific, Europeans arrived, they brought with them diseases for which the local populations did not have immunity, and the results were absolutely devastating to the population. So why would we have anything different here on Rapa Nui? Now, in the 19th century, Rapa Nui really faced a fatal impact in terms of interactions with explorers, missionaries, and traders. We have a very high level of introduced European diseases. The blackbirding trade, where Peruvian slave traders arrived in 1862, they took thousands upon thousands of men to the guano mines off the coast of Peru. Just 12 of those individuals, 12 of those men survived the voyage back to Rapa Nui, and with them they brought smallpox. That epidemic decimated the population. In 1877, Rapa Nui's population was down to just 110 individuals. So we're talking about a population loss probably of at least 98% of the population. So what does that mean in terms of knowledge? Of course, that means that a lot of knowledge was lost. A lot of oral traditions were lost. as people pass away, so too does their knowledge. And so it wasn't until really the late 1800s and early 1900s that ethnographers visited the island, and residents on the island started to write things down and started to write down what we refer to as salvage ethnographies to try to get as much information from the elders as they could. So we can note Thompson, Rutledge, Mittrau, and Englert as sort of the major sources of information in terms of ethnographies. Now, in terms of those ethnographies, when we look at the information that they contain, a lot of times people like to tell stories, right? People like to sensationalize things. And so when we read these salvage ethnographies, we have to do so with a grain of salt. And, for example, if we look at Catherine Rutledge's 1919 ethnography, she notes that the Great Poike Trench is, this site of this mythical battle that took place. And that's what Thor Heyerdahl based his date of collapse of 1680 on, was a radiocarbon date from this particular feature. And what Routledge actually wrote about some 35 years previously is that this was probably a natural feature for which the people came up with a great story, right? And it's something that we still do today. So it makes total sense. So when we think about the ethnographies, it's very likely that some of the stories, perhaps some of the oral traditions, we should take with a grain of salt, and others have noticed that those oral traditions oftentimes refer to the historic period and not necessarily to the pre-European contact period and what life was like back then. So if we think about a summary of the evidence then, what I hope that I've outlined for you tonight, I was going to bring notes, but I was afraid they'd fly away, is that the criteria for the collapse is based on very limited data, including assumptions about artifact use, such as the mata'a and human remains in middens, ambiguous dating of proposed settlement shifts. So those major settlement shifts, again, are based on the dating of just eight sites or 8 features, and also changes in burial practices. We have the extrapolation of small-scale occurrences, like the abandonment of agricultural field systems, and also erosion that are getting extrapolated to island-wide phenomena. Limited European accounts, which generally don't support this notion of pre-European contact collapse, and ethnographic accounts that may relate more to the post-European contact period. So if I return now that you have some background, returning to our research, this is sort of where our research came out of. In doing all of this background research and stopping and saying, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense, we started to question a lot of things. And so we started to question things and started to come up with ways that we could actually address these questions and these gaps in the evidence. Maybe we would fill them, maybe we wouldn't, right? Fill or refute. It's anybody's guess when you're starting a research project. So again, we did so on island-wide and micro-regional scales, looking at settlement and land use. How do you do that? Well, in terms of land use, this is actually the component of the project that my colleagues have been doing. So although I was involved in the fieldwork portion of this, this wasn't actually my focus. They wanted me, of course, to focus on finishing my PhD, which luckily I did last year. So their major goals are to understand the changing human landscape interaction, or how people are interacting with the local environment on Rapa Nui, and looking at questions about that notion of widespread physical erosion. Do we have evidence of that in the soils themselves? And what about the soils themselves and the nutrient dynamics of those soils? So what Dr. Ladefoged and Dr. Stevenson and our other colleagues have done is to look at changing agricultural strategies. And the major agricultural features on the island are these manavai, which are stacked stone enclosures, and those are used for crops like bananas that need good protection from the wind. And then the major agricultural feature that wasn't even identified as an archaeological feature until just a few years ago by our colleague Sonia Hawa on the island what these are these very extensive rock gardens where people strategically placed rocks on the surface of the ground. And so this has been the primary focus of my colleagues, is characterizing these different agricultural strategies and how they change through time. So if we think about agriculture and vegetation clearance, of course, we can think about the island society and how it functioned through time. Now, a lot of attention, of course, is paid to the moai, or the statues. And so if we look at Rapa Nui, just as we see elsewhere in the Pacific, what we're dealing with is a very hierarchical society of agriculturalists, right? People arrive on the island and they use slash and burn agriculture. They bring their transported economy with them, especially very important starchy plants like taro and sweet potato or kumara. And so they slash and burn. We find lots of evidence of planting pits like the one that Dr. Stevenson is pointing to here. And they also started to intensify their agriculture. And on Rapa Nui, we have a somewhat unique instance of the flourishing of these rock gardens. Now, we do see similar features elsewhere, including in New Zealand and the Cook Islands, but nowhere else do we see them covering huge portions of the landscape. For example, in my project area, 30% of the ground surface is covered by rock gardens. So they are absolutely everywhere. And as you can see, the Rapa Nui people today do use them, and they plant their taro in the rock gardens. So if we think about the reasons for vegetation clearance, of course, beginning with slash and burn agriculture, then intensification with the building of rock gardens, of course, results in very high production values, which can then support the chiefly economy and specialists in society, like the specialized carvers who carved up to 1,000 moai at the central quarry of Rano-Raraku. Now, in terms of rock gardens, right, what are the advantages to these? Now, a number of scholars have noted that rock gardens could have some advantages, including facilitating water permeability. On Rapa Nui, there is a lot of rainfall, but there's also a lot of wind. And so what happens is you lose a lot of water permeability going into the soils and staying there. It'll rain, and then the rains will be followed by winds, and then everything dries out very quickly. So what scholars have noticed is that the building of rock gardens facilitates water permeability, also reduces evaporation, protects the soils from erosion, and also protects the plants from wind damage. So we have lots of small windbreaks within these rock gardens and poo, or depressions. Now, what our colleagues' research has shown is that these perhaps also enhance the nutrient levels in the soils themselves. And Dr. Ladefoged and our team published these results in 2010, and the research is ongoing. So how do we measure soil fertility? The obvious answer, of course, is phosphorus, right? You all know that. I'm just kidding. So in tropical agricultural systems, phosphorus availability often limits productivity. And this is something that Professor Vitusek and Professor Chadwick and Professor Ladefoged, actually working over in Kohala, found, is that there's actually a sweet spot of phosphorus that ancient Hawaiian farmers found in the Kohala context, and ancient Rapa Nui farmers also found in the context of these rock gardens. And so how do we measure it? We measure it by digging a lot of holes and bringing the soils back and sending the soils to our colleagues Oliver Chadwick and Peter Vitusek, and then they analyze the soils and look at the phosphorus levels. So these are just a couple profiles of some of the test units that are dug in the gardens to show you that you have rocks on the surface in some instances, and then an agricultural horizon with no rocks. In other instances, we also have lithic mulching going on. And those rocks that are mulched into the soils are actually breaking down and increasing the phosphorus availability as they break down and become soil. So how do we do wide-scale soil nutrient sampling? Well, we sample a lot of areas. So to date, the team has sampled 541 locations across the island in different agricultural and volcanic settings. What this map is a map of all the geological substrates on Rapa Nui, all the different soil types. And so initially what we did was to travel around the island and target specific volcanic flows to look at the nutrient dynamics on each of those flows, both within gardens and outside of it. And as a sort of control, we ran a transect across the island, and that goes across flows that are similarly aged. So that's sort of the control in terms of looking at nutrient levels and elevation in that instance. So initially we went out in 2005 and we targeted garden areas in each of the volcanic substrates. And so here I am. It's a very tough place to work, as you can tell, just a horrible view. Working together with Professor Stevenson, and we're out excavating within a garden. So what we would do is take a sample from within the garden and just outside of the garden, which you can see is that clear area in the background, and compare the nutrient levels. Now, later on, we went back and did a semi-random sampling, more intensive sampling of some of these garden areas. And so here we have Professor Chadwick, Professor Ladefoged, and their field assistant, Emily, out excavating. So we dug 10 holes within gardens and then 10 holes outside of them. And then most recently in 2012, Dr. Ladefoged returned with students from the University of Auckland, and they ran transects. And so here the photographer is standing on an outcrop, which Rapa Nui people would actually break apart and move the rocks onto the rock gardens in those sweet spots next to these outcrops. And then we have other samples being taken outside of the garden in the background once again. So these are just some of the results. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all the results of all of those 541 samples that were taken. But this is one of those transects that they dug last year in 2012. And what you can see here is the elevation. This is a slightly sloping elevation. This is the measurement of phosphorus to niobium, and this is the indicator of nutrient dynamics in relation to the surrounding landscape. So you have outcrop here in blue, which is the stone outcrop, and then the garden area in red, and the non-garden area in purple. And what you can see is that very significant level of 1, which indicates that we have heightened nutrient dynamics within the garden, and outside of the garden on this particular substrate, we have very depleted nutrient levels. So in terms of that evidence, then what we've shown and what my colleagues have shown is that there's not evidence for a collapse of a terrestrial resource base. That is, by intensifying the agriculture, by deforesting the island and intensifying the agricultural resources by building rock gardens, people were actually able to increase the nutrient levels of their soil. And so Rapa Nui soils, what they've found is that they're naturally quite low in nutrients, so it's a somewhat marginal environment in terms of productivity, and that has a lot to do with the age of substrate and the amount of leaching that's going on. But overall, what their research has found is that agricultural practices actually increase soil nutrient levels across the island. Now, if we turn to settlement and to my sub-study of this overall research program, and we look again at that cultural chronology in both space and time of Stevenson and Hawa that was based on very limited dating, this is really the story that my PhD research sought to test, right, to empirically assess. And so, of course, what I was looking for and what I expected, actually, is that we would have evidence of this widespread abandonment of the interior areas of the island. And so, if we look at the Hangaho'onu project area, which was the region where I focused most of my research, and we look at the previous radiocarbon dates that were collected in the area. So here on the y-axis we have time, and on the x-axis we have sample numbers. And so these are divided into, based on these zones, these landscape use zones that Stevenson and Hawa came up with. And so what we have is this sacred coastal zone, the sort of coastal lowlands where we have lots of domestic activities going on, a very highly intensified plantation area that's outlined in green there, and then the far interior area of Hangaho'onu. And so we conceptualize this area as sort of a microcosm for the whole island, because what you have is these distinctive zones of use, right? Down on the coast, people are building ceremonial architecture. In the coastal lowlands, people are living, carrying out day-to-day activities. And then in the interior, we have this very highly intensified rock garden at the Mangapukopuhi plantation area. And so if you look at the previous dates, these are radiocarbon dates that are at 1 standard deviation, what you do see is evidence for that supposed shift in use, right? We have lots of Ahu dates that are clustering very early on in the cultural sequence, and then a break, and then in terms of the residential features that have been dated down on the coast, they are all very recent and right up into the historic period. Now in the coastal lowlands, what they proposed is settlement use throughout the entire cultural sequence, and then in the interior we have mostly agricultural dates, which are indicated by green squares here, that are very early, one that's a little bit late, but what that led them to do is to say that perhaps we do have evidence of widespread abandonment of those areas. So in order to test this model, what I did was return to the area, and I carried out a large landscape research project, which I won't go into the details of tonight, maybe for another day. And so I excavated near a number of houses at variable distances from the coast. And so this is an example of one of my excavations where we have the entrance sill of the house of small pavement, and then we placed our excavation units just in front of the pavement in an attempt to recover obsidian debitage from somebody sitting on their front porch making mata'a, for example, and also associated charcoal for radiocarbon dating. Now, when it comes to radiocarbon dating is kind of tricky business for archaeologists. So if you ask an archaeologist, when were the Hawaiian Islands initially settled? Most people will go, stop for a minute. Well, it was probably around 1000 to 1100 AD, right? And so this is why. It is impossible to assign a single calendar date to a radiocarbon sample. Okay, so if we look at this graph, this is kind of complicated, I know, but this is a graphic representation of the calibration curve. And so what you can think of this as is the radiocarbon clock. Sometimes it speeds up, time flies, and sometimes it slows down. And so that has a direct impact on our radiocarbon dates, our calibrated radiocarbon dates that we report from archaeological sites. So say, for example, this is one of my dates. I excavated a house site and submitted a piece of charcoal. So that piece of charcoal that I've submitted was associated in the same layer as obsidian debitage. So what I'm trying to date, of course, is that activity of that person sitting on their front porch making stone tools. But what I'm actually dating by using radiocarbon dating is when that plant or tree died, right? And so the trick is for us as archaeologists is to choose samples that accurately reflect the target archaeological date with the date of when that plant died. And so what we look for are identified species that are short-lived so that we don't get dates that are older than they should be, or older than that date, that event that we're trying to date. So in this instance, this is an instance where the clock sped up here, and then it slowed down, and then it sped up again, slowed down, and sped up. And so what we have with these dates is not a calendar date, it's actually a range of probability. So to put this into layman's terms, this tree that's associated with the obsidian that the person was flaking on their front porch may have died here, may have died sometime between 1710 and 1720, It may have died and been incorporated into the archaeological record sometime between 1810 and 1850, or 1880 and 1930. Now that's at one standard deviation. If we pull it out to 2, then we have an even bigger range, right? So we have an 84% chance that that target event probably occurred sometime between 1800 and 1950. Tricky business, right? Makes our jobs very difficult and leads to very heated discussions amongst us at conferences. So if you take all of the dates from the Hanga Ho'onu project area, we collected 15 samples that we submitted for dating, and what you can see when you superimpose those on the calibration curve is those speeding and slowing of the curve, or the peaks and troughs that are created by the calibration curve itself. So very tricky business when it comes to interpreting these dates, but that's what I'm going to do tonight. So when we think about spatial and temporal trends then, and trickiness of radiocarbon dating aside, central question in this particular region: do we have evidence of complete abandonment of that interior, especially the interior Mongapukopuhi plantation area? And this is a photo of that plantation area, which will actually be on display in Pacific Hall, opening in a couple weeks on the 21st of September. And this is a rock garden, of course, that's in use for the planting of dryland taro, or taro as they call it on Rapa Nui. Okay, so if we then just isolate the dates that come from interior zones, right, in the Hanga Ho'onu project area, what we see if we just look at the ones from the Mongapukopuhi plantation area, or the intensified rock garden in the inland, if we look at that first one and look at the probability distribution, yeah, I'll buy that that may have been abandoned before European contact, even before the supposed collapse at 1680. However, if we look at the other 4 dates that come from that context, from that same landscape zone, what we see is that the majority of the probability distributions of each one of those dates actually falls in the post-contact period. So what that may suggest is that that area was still being used, that intensified agricultural area was still being used, and the houses that are within it were still being occupied during the post-contact period. So in terms of the Hanga Ho'onu area then, years ago, a prominent researcher asked me, yeah, but what if that's the exception to the rule? What about the rest of the island? Sure, you might not have abandonment of the interior regions in Hanga Ho'onu up here, but what about the rest? And so that led me to compile an island-wide database. This database, as you can tell, is the result of 58 years of very intensive archaeological research on Rapa Nui. We have 313 dates that come from archaeological contexts, plus another 152, which are not on this map, from paleoecological contexts. So a lot of dates have been submitted from this island, and over 30,000 archaeological features have been documented as well on the surface of the island. If I tried to put them on this map, however, it would be one big blob. So as you can tell, a lot of research has been done. So we have quite a good database in terms of the radiocarbon dating of archaeological sites. So the first step when looking at any large island-wide database is to assess the reliability of dates. Now, I'm not going to get into this discussion because it's a long one, but just remember what we've done is classified those dates based on how close that charcoal, the death of that particular plant, might be to the target archaeological event of interest that we're actually trying to date. And so the most reliable dates are Class 1 dates, and those are on identified short-lived species, so species that only live for a few years, so that you get a really precise date and don't have the problem of old wood from an old piece of wood that's been incorporated. And of course, looking at context. For archaeologists, context is everything. So these are not only on identified short-lived species of wood, but they're also associated with secure archaeological deposits. Now, Class 2 dates, of course, can also yield some information, and these are on unidentified wood charcoal, also from secure archaeological contexts. I left them in, especially for this study, because in terms of the old wood problem, when I'm dealing with the sort of later portion of the sequence, it's not really going to affect the interpretation all that much. So still some information to gain from those, and class 3, we won't talk about them. So in terms of the overall settlement trends, then the first step is to classify your dates, and then to really look at the overall distribution of them. And what we noticed is that we have an example of what my colleague Simon Bickler and I like to call hotspot archaeology. 90 dates come from Akina, which is the nice sandy beach on the coast, up on the north coast, and according to oral traditions, this is the original settlement site. So archaeologists have flocked to this area. It's also a very nice beach, nicest beach. One of the nicest beaches on the island. And so a lot of people have worked at Akina. About 27% of the dates from Rapa Nui come from this singular location. Now, sort of a close second with the inclusion of my recent research, the Hangaho'onu area and other areas across the island. So what this map really shows is that you have huge areas where we haven't actually sampled archaeologically speaking, which is somewhat problematic, and also not, because it means that I can hopefully go back to Rapa Nui and continue this research next year. So if we look at those sampling locations again, then what I did in order to analyze them spatially is to divide the island up based on distance from coast. So these blue bands are distance bands that are at 500-meter increments coming inland from the coast, and what you can see sort of in this map is that there's been a large coastal bias to research. You can really see that if you look at these pie charts. Over 2/3 of the dates, both class 1 and class 2 dates, come from 0 to 500 meters from the coast. So in terms of assessing overall settlement, somewhat difficult to do. We have a very limited sample of dates coming from the very far inland regions. So this is all of the dates, very difficult to fit onto one PowerPoint slide, but these are the calibrated class 1 and 2 dates. So here we have time going up on the y-axis and distance from coast going side to side on the x-axis. So if we look at those near coastal or coastal lowlands, of course that sampling bias there, and then the inland zones. But what I want you to pay attention to on this graph is this red line. This is the date of the supposed collapse of Rapa Nui society. And so what we see is a lot of dates that are clustering after that time, both in the near coastal and coastal lowland zones and also in those further inland zones. Now the one area that we need to target next is the very far upland. That's 3.5 kilometers and more from the coast up on the slopes of Terivaca, and that's what we're hoping to do in the next couple of years here, is to go back there, because it looks like it could be that these 8 dates are clustering to the pre-collapse period, but it also could be a sampling bias. We only have 8 dates from those areas, so very small sample. Okay, so in terms of assessing radiocarbon dates then, and looking at the overall distribution in terms of time, what I did was to sum the probabilities. All of those little probability distributions have been summed together, and this is what that sum looks like. Now what I noticed is some of these peaks and troughs, and so if we look at the class 2 sum, which is in blue, and the class 1 in black, you do see this dip, right, that occurs right around the time of the supposed collapse. And that's what led our predecessors to say, oh yeah, we have evidence of that. You have a dip in the frequency of radiocarbon dates, so perhaps that means a dip in population levels. But what I did was to create this artificial data set. So I assigned dates every 10 years to reflect continuous incorporation of charcoal into the record, all the way up to European contact. and so, or to the time when radiocarbon dating is useful, up to 90 plus or minus 30 years before present. And so what you'll notice in looking at these summed probabilities, when you compare the blue curve and the black curve, that is the class 1 and the class 2 dates, to that simulated or artificial data set, what you see is this peak and this trough at the same time. And so what that indicates to us is that that drop in the probability isn't actually meaningful in terms of human behavior. It's actually just reflecting the slowing down of that radiocarbon calibration clock. So quite interesting. I was jumping out of my chair when I saw this. Okay, so what about abandonment of the interior regions then? That's the real data that we want to look at. Those are the real data to look at. So what we did was to simulate that artificial data set again, so that's in gray, and just to compare it to the inland dates. So these are all of the class 1 and 2 inland dates in black, and once again you can see that those curves are markedly similar. And then, of course, to also test the collapse, right? We can't just test for continuity, which we have pretty good evidence of. We said, okay, let's see what a collapse would look like. So created another artificial data set and compared that. So it cuts off at 1680, uncalibrated. You calibrate the dates, and that's what it looks like, is that red line. So what you can see very clearly, I think, with the summed probabilities is that we don't have evidence on a micro-regional scale in Hangaho'onu, nor do we have evidence overall on an island-wide scale for the widespread abandonment of those inland locations. Now, if we just isolate the most reliable dates, just to appease our critics, and look at just the class 1 or the most reliable dates from agricultural contexts, what I've done here is to model what the collapse scenario would look like. So I've told the program, okay, these dates will not post-date AD 1680, right, according to that collapse narrative. And so what you see here in that gray area, that's where it doesn't conform to the model. So again, we have the majority of these probability distributions. These are from agricultural contexts on the island, and they are dating to the post-quote collapse. They don't meet the expectations of that model. When we look at the residential dates, 6 out of 11, again, of the most reliable class 1 dates from residential contexts, again, don't meet the expectations of the collapse model. So what that indicates to us is that the chiefly economy was still going strong. People were still living in the inland areas, and perhaps there wasn't this anarchistic breakdown of the chiefly economy and a contraction back to coastal locations. So to summarize then, what I hope that I've shared with you tonight is some of the major gaps in the empirical evidence for pre-European contact societal collapse on the island, and also the results of our colleagues' research that show that agricultural intensification actually enhanced the productivity of this somewhat marginal environment on Rapa Nui. There's no evidence of a widespread, not evidence currently, of a widespread settlement shift during the late pre-European contact period in terms of settlement patterns and overall land use and settlement. And perhaps it's more appropriate to view this island as a story of success and resilience rather than as one of collapse. Mahalo nui loa, or as they say on Rapa Nui, Maururu roa. Thanks. Are there any questions? Yeah? No, I did not present a plot of population versus time. Estimating population levels is very difficult to do. There are a number of ways that archaeologists have approached that. One of them is counting houses, right? And so you count all the houses on the landscape, you estimate that 6 people, an average of 6 people, lived in each house, and then you have a population estimate for the island. Well, the problem on Rapa Nui is that, of course, there's a lot of recycling going on. There's a lot of rebuilding over the top of older structures. And so to pinpoint how many people were using the landscape at any one particular point in time is very difficult to do. So no, I don't have a population estimate for how quickly or how slowly the population may have increased on that island. Yeah?
In regards to the Jason Scott Lee movie, I hate to go there.
That's okay.
What are your top 3 most egregious faults with that movie?
Okay, the top 2. Okay, the question was in regards to Kevin Costner's epic blockbuster, Rapa Nui, the movie, that was produced by Kevin Costner, of course, and starred Jason Scott Lee. What are my 2 top criticisms of that movie? Well, of course, the floating iceberg at the end. I mean, come on. Right? The Rapa Nui people are being saved by a floating iceberg, and the Ariki Mao believes that that's his salvation and his baka? No, come on. No, but that aside, that movie. No. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a classic thing. And they did consult archaeologists. They consulted a couple archaeologists from the Universidad de Chile at the time on that movie. And, that was the popular narrative. And that was, the sort of consensus amongst archaeologists back in the early 1990s. And so I guess I can't fault it completely. But, yeah, I often show that film to students, to archaeology students, and they're very entertained by it, or I assign it as homework. And then I present a lecture like the one that I've presented to you today, to basically, say, hey, don't believe everything you see. Hollywood gets it wrong sometimes, as we all do. But, yeah, I think the iceberg's number 1. Number 2, the other thing that really bothered me about that film is, or I don't know, for me personally, it was just kind of strange to see Mulrooney speaking with New Zealand accents on Rapa Nui, because of course it was filmed on Rapa Nui. But, yeah, I don't want to talk about that movie. I'm going to go to the back there. Oh, okay, so for that movie, let me backtrack. That's what I disagree with most. I haven't seen that movie in a long time. But, yeah, they actually constructed an ahu up at Orongo that never existed there. And, yes, that moai was facing the wrong way. Yeah. I think that's the only one that they show on a regular basis. But that's not even, a real site. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, sure. So the question was about Terry Hunt and Carl Lippo's cultural chronology, which begins very late compared to other archaeological estimates for the initial settlement of the island. And what Hunt and Lippo did was to look at the probability distributions of radiocarbon dates. And they proposed a late settlement date of 1200. And they are known to be somewhat conservative. There's a whole program called chronometric hygiene. So you only accept dates, or you only classify dates as class 1, most reliable dates, if they meet a certain set of criteria. And that's just what they did. And so they did a statistical analysis that was then followed up by other archaeologists working on the island, led by Brett Shepherdson, who's been working on the island for over a decade. And he argues, based on the same data set, that the initial date of colonization is probably, a conservative estimate, is 1080 AD. So here we have an instance where 2 groups of scholars, of researchers, have looked at the same data set and come up with a different interpretation based on statistical methodologies that they employed. So yeah, so they do argue for late settlement. In terms of the overall consensus, of everybody working on the island, with the exception of them, most people will tell you that the radiocarbon dating evidence suggests that it was probably about 1000 to 1100 AD. 1200 is a conservative estimate for initial colonization and settlement. The question is, were there ever coconut trees growing on Rapa Nui? So the coconut trees that are there now were planted in 1960. They're from Tahiti. But in the past, there was a large palm forest. And so in terms of the vegetation in the past, it was dominated by that palm forest. And we oftentimes do find palm nut remains in archaeological deposits, and also coconut shell. So there were coconut trees, but they were a secondary tree in terms of usefulness. Yeah. Wait a minute. I'm gonna answer one in the back, and then we'll come back to you. So Flenley and his colleagues have proposed that the deforestation began around 1000 AD and was complete by no later than 1640 AD. And so in terms of the paleoecology, they've sort of slotted that in with the cultural chronology and seen that there's good agreement between that date, that estimate of 1640, and the supposed collapse at 1680. The problem with the with the pollen cores is that some of the dates are inverted. You have a floating Totora reed mat that floats in the middle of those crater lakes, and so it inverts the dates. So the dating is constantly being revised. There's a team from Spain who's been working there who actually argues that the deforestation occurred significantly earlier than that, but it doesn't match up with the archaeological evidence. Yeah? Oh.
You mentioned that there's some pretty selected areas that have been more intensely scrutinized. Do you feel that is there evidence to suggest there was a higher density population in other areas of the island?
Yeah, so
Places you're excited to get to?
Yeah. So the question is are there certain areas that have higher densities of archaeological features, perhaps, or settlement? And generally speaking, the density drops off at 1 kilometer from the coast. So you have very dense settlement on the coast, which is why I use that drop-off, right? In the interior areas, it's not as dense, definitely. It's mostly agricultural field systems with pockets of settlements. Yeah. There's no empty areas of the island that I know of. Up on the upper slopes of Terivaka, there are some areas that don't have very high densities, but there's definitely archaeological sites up there. Yeah. Gentleman in the back. Yeah. Yeah. As you saw in some of the photos, so the question is, do people still utilize rock gardens today on Rapa Nui? And yeah, definitely. The taro or taro that you saw in those photos, people planted there. So they're definitely still in use. They plant taro, sweet potato, and other recreational plants sometimes too, and a whole range of plants. So the rock gardens are definitely still in use on the island. Yeah, not to the extent that they used to be, but once in a while.
When Terry Hunt came here and gave a lecture, he talked about the introduction of rats by Westerners.
Mm-hmm.
What was your study on that?
So the question was about Terry Hunt's research and the role of rats. So Dr. Hunt and his colleagues emphasized that the rats may have played a prominent role in the lack of regeneration of that palm forest, because what we find in archaeological deposits is that a lot of the seeds are gnawed on, the seed casings, and so that indicates that perhaps the rats also played a role in the deforestation of the island. But if we look at the overall picture, and especially the work of Meath and Bork, what we see is good evidence of truncated palm, where they've been actually cut down with a charcoal layer right on top. So we do have evidence of widespread slash and burn agriculture taking place, and of course the rats would have had a role as well, the Polynesian rats, or kiore, that the Polynesian settlers brought with them. So yeah, definitely how big a role they played is anybody's guess, but yeah, definitely an interesting theory. Yep. Yeah, so the question is about the statues and the toppling of the statues, and whether they were all toppled by people or were also toppled by natural disasters. Now, in terms of the statue toppling period, the first evidence that we have of it is from Cook in 1774 in terms of that process of toppling the statues, or the Huri Moai period, as it's called on the island. The last statue was toppled sometime in the 1860s. So it went on for a long time, and the statues, if you look at them, a lot of them are decapitated. Now, whether that was intentional by people placing stones at exactly the right place so that they would fall is, possible, or perhaps that's just, a logical place for a statue to break. The statues were erected on the Ahu, facing inland in their territories. People placed them up, and then the elite villages, when you walked out of your house, if you had very high status, there are your ancestors looking down on you and protecting you. And so when we think about the toppling of the statues, the way that I envision it, and there's no way, absolutely no way to prove or disprove this, but I envision it as a psychological change that came with European contact. You look at your people dying all around you, and you can't explain why. You might not have an explanation. Maybe you start to lose faith in your ancestors and their ability to protect you. So perhaps it was different warring groups, or perhaps people were pulling down their own statues. I don't know. Again, lots of questions. It's always good to end. I always say it's good to end a field season with more questions than answers. And sometimes it's the same when you come to a lecture, right? Yeah. Okay, the question is there any evidence of navigation or astronomy being practiced on the island? And the answer is yes. Some of the Ahu do have, just like here in Hawaii with the heiau, some of the Ahu do have astronomical alignments. And yes, a great deal of archaeoastronomy has been done on the island, and we do find that they are aligned significantly in some instances, yes. Okay, the question is, what excites me most about what I'm doing? Oh, that's a tough question. Well, I mean, I think any researcher will tell you it's about, discovering things that you never imagined and uncovering things that you never imagined. So for me, it's, as I say, it's always about coming up with more questions and more questions to answer and more reasons to go back. Right? To go back and keep carrying out research and sharing those results with the local community. One of my favorite moments, I'll share that with you. One of my favorite moments was when we're on the island, we always make a point to give public lectures at the local museum. And they're always in Spanish, so I'm thankful tonight that my lecture was not in Spanish. But a couple years ago, Thane, Dr. Latifoget, and I were on the island, and he gave a lecture to the local community, and it was all about the rock gardens. Now, keep in mind that rock gardens weren't even acknowledged as an archaeological feature until just a couple years ago, and there was a local tour guide sitting in the back, and she started crying because she was so happy to finally hear somebody talking about the successfulness of Rapa Nui culture and celebrating their culture, her culture, instead of talking about notions of collapse. So I think that was one of my favorite moments. So one of the things that excites me most, of course, is sharing my knowledge, not only with all of you, but also with the descendants of the ancient Rapa Nui people. Any other questions? So I just want to thank you all again. And don't forget, Pacific Hall, grand unveiling, Saturday, September 21st. It's a free event, of course, for everybody. And it's going to be a lot of fun. And we do have a lecture that's going to be delivered by Patrick Kirch, who is probably the most prominent scholar in Pacific archaeology. He's going to be here to deliver a lecture at noon, and then he'll be doing a book signing of his latest book entitled A Shark Going Inland Is My Chief. So definitely come along to that as well.
Mahalo for listening. If you have any questions or comments on this or other online audio programs, please visit us online at www.bishopmuseum.org. If you like us on Facebook, you'll be alerted when new programs are available. Ahui ho from the Bishop Museum.